I learned of my mother Susan's death on the bed of my apartment where I live. I found out about the news of her death from a phone call from my stepfather, George, and for some reason, I was fixated on the hands of the clock hanging on the wall, continuing to stare. As I watched the second hand move continuously, I realized this was reality and I started to cry. George took care of all the funeral arrangements. My mother had many relatives and friends, and many people gathered for the funeral. I was told by George, "Emily, you don't have to do anything," and so I left all matters regarding the funeral to him. During the funeral, there was the figure of my father, David, who had vanished long ago. He was much smaller and thinner than I remembered from my memories, with a somber expression on his face. I watched the back of my father as he finished offering the flowers. After all the attendees had finished placing roses and the coffin was carried out, George briefly spoke, and the funeral was over. After watching the hearse carrying my mother drive away, I rushed to my father, grabbed his arm, and dragged him out of the funeral home to glare at him. "What do you want now? I don't even want to see your face." "I'm sorry, actually that day." The sky, which had been clear until recently, turned overcast, and as my father began to speak, a quiet drizzle started to fall. "My name is Emily. This year, I'm turning 40 and have been busy working as a nurse. There's a reason I've remained single and never had a serious relationship with a man up to this age." "Dad left you, Emily," my mother, Susan, would say repeatedly, as if it were her catchphrase, emphasizing that my father abandoned me. 23 years ago, my real father, David, left me and my mother and disappeared somewhere. My father was a kind man. Coming home from his job as a chef at a Chinese restaurant chain, he always brought the smell of oil and soy sauce with him. I was young back then and would turn away in disgust at the scent when I ran into him coming home late at night. While I was studying for tests late into the night in my room, he would bring in fried rice he made in the kitchen. "No thanks, I'll get fat if I eat at this hour." Coming home from work without even taking a shower, he must have immediately started preparing my midnight snack. The scent of spices lingered on my father's clothes. Exhausted, he tried to place the fried rice on my study desk, so I pushed the plate back and yelled, "Stop it. Don't disturb me." My father opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something but then just silently smiled and left the room. I suppose I was going through adolescence, and I now reflect on that time with regret. However, as I continued studying in my room for a while, I couldn't help but cover my ears as I heard my father yelling at my mother from the living room. The scary shouting, different from the gentle demeanor usually shown to me, echoed through the house, instilling in me a profound fear not so much of the content of the shouting but of the raw anger exposed. The day after my father had shouted, he didn't go to work at the time he was supposed to, instead sitting and watching the news on TV. I faintly heard a news anchor with a serious expression reporting that a restaurant somewhere had caused food poisoning and was now closed. I felt as if the scene in front of me was warping. It was a sunny Sunday, and the light was streaming through the curtains like dappled sunlight, creating a very pleasant atmosphere while my mother sat in a chair, crying. Sorry, so sorry, Emily." I didn't understand what she was apologizing for and didn't try to ask. After a while, my parents got divorced. I sincerely wished they would wait until after my exams, but my mother seemed to have reached her limit of endurance, probably not noticing my tense feelings. Sometimes when I returned from school, I found my mother sitting in the dark living room, crying alone. When I asked, "Are you okay?" she would respond with a lonely look, "Your father left us, Emily." Those words felt like a curse to me. I never knew why my father disappeared. Since my mother didn't talk much about it, I could only guess that he might have run off with another woman. "Don't worry about money. I will definitely take care of everything." She reassured me after my father left, though she didn't seem to be working extra or even part-time. My mother remarried a few years later. By then, I was attending nursing school and, thanks to my new stepfather, George, I was able to live a comfortable life. George, 2 years older than my mother, was a businessman who owned several restaurant chains. He treated me like his real daughter, or rather, his displays of affection were so excessive that I was a bit bewildered. Whenever I sat on the couch at home, he would naturally sit next to me, and he meticulously washed and folded my underwear and clothes. George always said, "I love Emily," as if she were my real daughter. Contrary to the kindness of this father figure, I instinctively felt uncomfortable around George. His casual glances and gestures towards me didn't feel fatherly, but rather seemed to come from a man's perspective. You don't have to force yourself to call me Dad. Just keep calling me George," he told me in a gentle tone. During my school years, my life was affluent, and George offered to give me an allowance, but I chose to start working part-time at a bar to have my own money to spend freely. Understanding the difficulty of earning money and deeply feeling grateful towards George, I continued to study hard to become a nurse capable of living on my own. "Why don't you cut back on the part-time job? George said he would provide money, so you don't have to push yourself." But I knew well that my earnings from the bar were nowhere near enough for my tuition, yet I kept on trying to cover at least a part of it. I didn't want to become a weak woman who, like my mother, was abandoned by her father and still couldn't live without depending on someone else. After graduating from nursing school, I started working as a nurse in a general hospital, living through busy days. I often faced situations where I was involved in crucial moments of someone's life or health. That made my job fulfilling, and every day felt new. As a rookie nurse, I was not only learning the job but also constantly working hard to adapt to the new environment. There were times when I had to perform procedures under time pressure and even felt scared occasionally. The salary deposited into my account monthly was the reward for these tough days. Without indulging in any luxuries, I saved money for the future. And I decided to start repaying George little by little for the tuition. Neither my mother, Susan, nor George would accept the money, showing troubled faces as they refused. I feel like I was still being treated like a child. It was a strange feeling, being responsible for someone's life as such a child. One afternoon off, I couldn't sort out my thoughts and tears flowed without reason. I, who had already moved out and was living alone, suddenly wanted to hear my mother's voice and called her. Over the phone, I abruptly said, "I want to see Dad." I referred not to my new stepfather but to my biological father, David, who had left us, and my mother, understanding immediately, after a long silence, said in a small voice, "I understand. Emily, you're already 22 years old. He has his own life now, so maybe you should start by writing him a letter." After hanging up, I immediately started writing a letter. I was talking about life since Dad left, how I'm working hard as a nurse. And how sad I was that Dad left without saying anything to me, even though I don't know the reason why he and Mom split up. I involuntarily stopped writing. Then, I started to rewrite the letter. Blaming my father for his absence accomplishes nothing. My mother didn't explain, but there must have been reasons for my father. Reasons for abandoning his only daughter and not even contacting. The words of my mother, "Your father left you, Emily," ruminate in my mind. Each time those words echo in my head, I become unable to write the letter to my father. The love and hatred I felt for my father overflowed, and I just couldn't write, "I want to see you." The only words I managed to squeeze out for my father were, "I have something I want to discuss." I entrusted that letter to my mother and waited for a reply. There was never a response from my father. Frustrated, I wrote scathing letters calling him an irresponsible father, and the worst person, and sent them through my mother. Days passed, but there was no letter from my father. Every week, when I had a day off from work, I would return to my parents' house to check if there was any reply from him. When I handed the third letter to my mother, she looked at me with a sad expression and began, "Emily, your father." But I inadvertently screamed. "He left me. I was abandoned." I sat down on the spot, hugged my knees, and cried. My stepfather, George, embraced my shoulders and gently stroked them. The touch of George's hand, his body odor, all felt disgusting to me. In the background, my mother turned on the kitchen exhaust fan. I imagined her smoking a cigarette. As the air in the house changed, the faint hope I had for my father seemed to be sucked away by the exhaust fan and disappeared. When I looked up with a tear-stained face, George was smiling. Despite finding it repulsive, thinking about how he truly cared for me like his own daughter and supported me through nursing school, I decided to stop writing letters to my father. George gently pressed my face against his chest. Unable to reject it, I simply closed my eyes quietly. Years have passed since then. I am now 40 years old. I have remained single all these years. Yet I live a decent life on my own. That has been my pride. Yet the person I wanted most to recognize this proud aspect of me was my mother, Susan, who unfortunately was not pleased about me being single. Whenever we met during Christmas or on holidays, she would ask without hesitation, "What about marriage? Haven't you found someone nice?" leading me to start distancing myself from her a little. Then one day, my real mother, Susan, passed away from an arrhythmia. It seems that my stepfather George's business has been growing significantly, and my mother continued to live a comfortable life as a stay-at-home wife without undergoing health checkups, collecting dresses as a hobby, and inviting friends and relatives to her home to enjoy what she called a dress-up teaching session. It seems that my mother passed away on the morning she was gathering her friends for one of these dress-up classes. A friend who found her collapsed in the living room called an ambulance, but she had already passed away before reaching the hospital. I learned of my mother's death lying on my bed in my apartment. I was staring at the hands of the clock on the wall as George informed me over the phone. I realized this was reality as I watched the second hand move, and I broke down in tears. George took care of all the funeral arrangements. My mother had many relatives and friends, and many people gathered for the funeral. I was told by George, "Emily, you don't have to do anything," and I left all the funeral matters to him. During the funeral, the solemn chanting by the priest echoed as attendees paid their respects before approaching me and George to bow. Among the line, there was the figure of my father, who had disappeared from our lives long ago. He looked much smaller and thinner than I remembered, with a somber expression on his face. I watched his back as he finished paying his respects. After the attendees finished their respects and the coffin was carried out, George briefly greeted everyone and ended the funeral. After sending off my mother in the hearse, while waiting for the bus to the crematorium, I rushed to my father, grabbed his arm, and dragged him forcefully outside the venue, glaring at him. "What do you want now? I don't even want to see your face." "I'm sorry, actually, that day." The sky that was clear until then turned overcast, and as my father started to speak, a quiet drizzle began to fall. The words that came from my father were unbelievable. He said that my mother had a severe habit of wasteful spending and they had countless arguments about household finances. My father, who was in charge of money management, had repeatedly warned her about her habit of impulsively buying dresses with her credit card, but she never stopped. Even she was going so far as to cancel the savings account intended for my college. Moreover, suspecting my mother's frequent outings, he hired a detective and discovered she was having an affair with George. I glared at my father with a skeptical look. "So, you were in charge of the finances and always angry about Mom's spending, but then you proudly hired a detective to uncover her affair? Detectives aren't cheap, right?" "Emily, I was." "That's okay. Let me hear it all." "I was only told by Mom that you left us." To avoid the increasingly heavy rain, my father and I, neither of whom were smokers, moved to the covered smoking area at the entrance of the funeral home. Perhaps because there are few smokers in our family, no one else was there. Finding out about the affair, I thought about asking Susan for a divorce. But it turned out she was the one who asked for it first. My mom, who had an affair with George, as you know, was a businessman with financial freedom. After divorcing my dad, she remarried George, seeking a wealthy lifestyle, and the divorce was finalized with mutual consent. It seemed obvious that my dad intended to take me with him after the divorce was settled. But Mom didn't want to let me go. Facing college entrance and an economically challenging period ahead, my dad, who had just lost his job at the restaurant, seemed uncertain about making ends meet on his own. Moreover, Mom convinced him that it would be pitiful for a girl of my age to suddenly start living with her father alone. "Even so, I wanted to live with you, Emily, but..." Seeing me always struggling with a pained expression due to my exam studies, he didn't know what to say, and when he just looked at me lovingly, I responded with a look of fear, making him unsure of what he was fighting for. Mom met with my dad at a time I wasn't around and asked him, "Emily is in a crucial phase with her exams. Please disappear quietly without causing any disturbance," and so he vanished without saying anything, thinking of me. At that time, I agreed. "But even after your exams were over and you started attending nursing school, your mother still found reasons to prevent me and you from meeting, saying you're just a freshman or it's just before a test." Frustrated by my dad's persistent attempts to see me, she said, "Emily is scared of you. It will make it hard for her to get used to her new family, so you should avoid meeting her." My dad added that none of the letters I sent him ever reached him. After finishing his story, he took a deep breath. Then he bowed deeply to me, apologizing for causing me pain without clearing up the misunderstanding. Glancing at the back of his slightly balding head, I looked away. "I came here today because I saw George, who remarried Susan, walking with another woman. I just couldn't stop worrying about the current you. Lift your head. It'll look weird if someone sees you like this. Slowly, my dad raised his head and looked at me. I met his gaze for a moment, then quickly looked away. Without saying anything, I stood up and walked back into the funeral home. There's no proof that what my dad was saying is true. Wanted to see me? I wish he would stop kidding. He never came to see me once in 23 years. He didn't see Mom because she told him not to? He stayed away because it would make it hard for me to fit in with a new family? Is that the only reason he didn't come to see me for 23 years? As I was lost in thought, George hurried over and looked into my face with concern. I guess he was worried because I had disappeared for a bit after the funeral, and that warmed my heart. Emily, if there's anything troubling you, just tell me. I'm here to help. George, with a natural motion, placed his hand on my head and started to slowly stroke it. I lowered my head slightly to hide my expression. Does he seriously think I enjoy having my head patted? He's not a bad person, but every move he makes triggers a visceral rejection inside me, a guilt I can't shake off. Perhaps it's because I am grateful for his financial support until I graduated from school and for letting my mom live as a homemaker as she pleased until she passed away. A few days later, I decided to stay at my childhood home for the first time in a while. George asked me to sort through my mother's belongings, telling me to take anything I might need. My mother owned many kimonos, but I don't know how to wear them and am not interested in them to begin with. I randomly pulled out one from the dresser, brought it close to my face, and rubbed it against my cheek. I have never seen my mother wearing these beautiful dresses, even though she claimed they were her hobby. Not knowing much about dresses, I decided to call a professional dealer later for an appraisal and was about to leave the room. Then, in the back of the closet filled with her dresses, I happened to spot 2 cookie tins. I couldn't imagine my mother collecting empty cookie tins as a hobby, so I reflexively reached out, thinking something was inside. A distant memory resurfaced of eating these cookies with my mother at some point. The round tin was filled with colorful cookies, and we laughed together, discussing which ones tasted good and which had a strange flavor. I washed the empty tin I finished eating from and said, "It's too good to waste, we should use it for something," to which my mother just gave a wry smile. Thinking that the round cookie tin I had carelessly set aside was hidden in the back of the closet by my mother and never saw the light of day until her death made my heart ache a bit. When I opened the cookie tin, it was filled with many letters. The first letter I happened to pick up was the one I entrusted to my mother to send to my father when I was 22. Becoming a nurse, I was crushed by daily anxiety, spending sleepless nights in agony. The letter, filled with my sudden wish to see my father, never reached its intended recipient and continued to sleep here. There were 3 letters I sent to my father. My mother had kept all of them in this cookie tin without giving them to him. But the tin didn't just contain my letters. There were many brown envelopes without any address or name written on them. Taking out one of the envelopes, it turned out to be a letter from my father addressed to me. No matter how much time passed, he was always supporting me, always loving me. I could always turn to him during hard or sad times. The letters contained such messages. I reached for another brown envelope. The content inside was similar, all expressing how much my father worried about me, and that I could always rely on him whenever I had trouble. Why did we? I screamed in my mind, why were my father and I so foolish? I could have looked up my father's address and sent him a letter without relying on my mother. And my father could have tried to find my address and sent a letter directly to me. Why did we think we couldn't communicate without putting my mother in between? Almost unconsciously, I pulled out more brown envelopes and took out the letters. Though my father's writing was clumsy, it wasn't filled with cheesy lines but with sincere thoughts throughout. That day, I hired a detective agency to investigate George. Reading the report handed over by the detective weeks later, I let out a deep sigh. George had been unfaithful many times since my mother was alive. He is currently dating a woman of my age. The content he allegedly shared with his workplace colleagues made my skin crawl with revulsion. Because he seemed to see me as a woman. There were times, though few, when I lived with him, such as during Christmas or summer vacation when I would go back to my parents' house, and he had said that just being in the same space as a young woman was thrilling. Thinking about the current woman he's having an affair with, who also has a daughter in her 20s, makes me feel nauseous imagining how he spends time with that mother and daughter. Knowing my mother was deceived for years, I was trembling with anger. I decided to confront George with the results of the investigation. Sitting across from each other at the table in the living room of my childhood home, George quietly closed his eyes and took a deep breath. You're confronting me with the fact that I had affairs, but what's the point now? Susan has passed away, hasn't she? I want you to divorce my mother posthumously. And please, never involve yourself with me again. George opened his eyes slightly and let out a small snort. I don't mind the posthumous divorce, but do you think it makes any sense? I told him firmly. It's for my mother's pride. I had always wondered why my mother never passed on the letters from my father. Why didn't she give me the letters from my father? Why did she remarry a man who constantly cheated? The detective who conducted the personal investigation mentioned that his affairs were habitual and my mother must have been aware of them. Yet, she never confronted him about his infidelity and remained silent because she wanted your financial support to ensure I grew up properly. After a food poisoning incident left my dad jobless, my mom decided he couldn't afford to send me to nursing school and pushed for a divorce. She then set her sights on George, who was financially well off, and managed to remarry, enduring life in silence, I believe. She feared losing her current financial security if she re-established ties with my dad, so she hid the letters to maintain the family structure of her, George, and me. Emily, if you continue to be disrespectful to me, I might have to reconsider how I treat you in the future. Is that what you want? My mother turned a blind eye to your affairs for my sake. But that's enough. I don't need a fake father anymore. After that, I never met George again. He was sued by the family of the last person he was involved with and is being demanded to pay alimony. The fact that he had been unfaithful since my mother was alive has spread as rumors to his company and clients, leading to a loss of trust and financial difficulties. Years have passed since my mother's death, and I still struggle to organize my feelings. As I advance in my nursing career and assume more responsible positions, the greater the pressure becomes, and I feel driven to share my worries with someone. Increasingly in contact with my father, David, who says, I've been through a lot myself, I understand, I felt a bit relieved. Thinking of my father's despair after losing his job and family makes my own struggles seem minor. Don't hold a grudge against your mom. I don't want you to live a life filled with resentment. My father advised, but I never held a grudge against my mother. She wanted to make me happy by any means necessary. My mother's belongings, known for being extravagant, were all valuable jewelry and high-value dresses, more for their resale value than practical use. My father also wished for my happiness and chose to step back. I visited my father's apartment after a long time. I noticed the sparsely furnished room with the bed laid out, but the kitchen stands out as exceptionally clean. Standing in that kitchen and watching my father cook with efficient movements, the nostalgic smell of oil and soy sauce filled the air. Here, the fried rice is ready. He presented the freshly made fried rice in front of me, lost in thought. The steam rose, and looking at the fragrant dish, I eagerly scooped it up with a spoon. Yeah, it's delicious. Really delicious. Don't rush. If you're still hungry, I'll make more. I paused and looked up at my father. Seeing his aged, wrinkled face smiling back, even more wrinkled than before, I couldn't help but let the tears fall. I'll find someone nice as soon as possible. Huh? Why does this topic come up while eating fried rice? I just said, whatever, to end the conversation, and shoved the fried rice into my mouth. Someday, I hope to marry someone who can cook as well as my dad. I can't say that in front of him, but I sincerely hope to meet someone like that one day.